Hey guys, and welcome to the first bonus video in our Pygame RPG series. In this video, we'll take a look at adding in a new enemy. This is something that I've had in mind for quite a while actually, but only recently decided to actually go ahead and implement because I think it's something interesting. Because if there's one area our game is lacking in, it's a good and interesting enemy to fight. Okay, so the standard enemy that we have currently is kind of lame and mostly just for a placeholder, it's just there to basically be something that we can attack, okay, and something that can inflict damage on us. There isn't really much value in that enemy, okay. So the new enemy that we're going to add right now is way more advanced, okay, and it's actually a believable enemy that we could see in an actual game. Okay, now when I was thinking about what kind of enemy to implement, I thought about maybe adding in some kind of melee enemy, but then I had the idea that if we're looking for interesting concepts to explain, in this series, then why not make a ranged enemy, one that actually shoots out projectiles, okay? Because I thought that the concept behind that would be pretty interesting to implement. So that's the enemy I decided to go ahead and make. Okay, so in today's video, we'll basically take a look at implementing this ranged enemy and dealing with all the problems and all the changes that we need to make to our code to accommodate it. Okay, so without further ado, let's begin. So the first thing I'll do is create a ranged enemy class. Okay, and something I need to actually say that basically the normal approach would be to create an enemy-based class and then derive all the other enemies from it. Basically inheritance, okay? Now that's what I would normally do as well. But there's a slight issue I faced here, is that the current enemy type that we have, I'll just call him the block enemy because he looks like a block. So the block enemy is a very incomplete enemy. He does not have the ability to attack, he cannot turn, he cannot follow the player, and yeah, pretty much. So he's a very basic enemy, and so basic that once we finish making the ranged enemy, you'll see that their functions are different, okay? Like their move functions, their update functions, they're all different. So unfortunately, it's a bit tricky to actually get inheritance working here, and it would kind of feel forced. Okay, so if you want to implement this concept later on, I would actually recommend that you create a new class for like melee enemy, because I don't think you'll ever be creating another enemy type where upon contact they hurt each other, right? Because the current enemy can't actually attack. He just touches the enemy, he touches the player and the player gets hurt. So I would recommend you create two classes, one for melee enemy, one for ranged enemy, and you create subclasses for melee enemy, okay, and subclasses for ranged enemy, okay. And the ranged enemy class that we'll make in this video will actually be a proper class, okay. And of course, this is all only if you want to extend the game even further, okay. It's just my, I just feel kind of obligated to actually mention all this and mention how to actually extend this later on, okay. Anyways, I think you get the point. So let's go over to our enemy class, copy over all the code, and then go to our ranged enemy class. And now there's a massive number of things that we actually need to be changing, okay. First of all, we should just lower this down because we did that only for for the mana potion video to increase the chances. So let's just tone that down to 10%, okay. Anyways, back to our ranged enemy, and we'll change the images over here, obviously, because we have these two new images here for left and right, okay. And what I'm going to do here is follow a new approach, and we need to move a little fast because there's a lot of code to actually be changing, so just pay close attention. Okay, I'm just going to change this over here, and depending on the direction we'll load the corresponding image, okay. So if that image is equal to that, okay, and else, no, or let's just go with elif, okay, is equal to 1, then do this. Okay, now 0 means right and 1 means left. So over here, I'll go and change this one to left. Okay, it's called enemy 2, by the way. What else? Okay, it looks good. Let's slow him down a bit because I want him to be a bit slower. Okay, and everything else looks good. Alright, move function, that's alright, that's alright. And one thing I want to do is actually remove this. Okay, I want to remove this because the ranged enemy can already, hit the player through his ranged attacks, through his projectiles. So I just want to remove this so that I just think it's a little unbalanced if the ranged enemy can hurt the player both by contact and by projectiles. So we'll remove this part. Okay, and just change this to an if statement. Okay, that's all. Now what else? We'll need to add in a few more functions in here for attack. Okay, and there'll need to be one for turning as well. So let's just create the empty functions for now and we'll populate them later. Okay, and okay, now to take care of some more immediate business, what else? All right, so of course ranged enemy, and what I'm going to do is from fireball import fireball. You see, what I want to do here basically is make the enemy shoot projectiles. Okay, and for now, since we already have the fireball for the player made, so why not just take that fireball and make the ranged enemy shoot out fireballs? If we want to change it, we just need to change the image, right? So yeah, pretty much. Later on, we could change the fireball class to a projectile class and then, just make it a very generalized thing so it can have any image and whatever. At any rate, let's just go down here to the attack function and create a fireball from the fireball class. Okay, that's what happens when the attack function is going to be called. And let's just open up the fireball class, okay, so that we can see what parameters it takes. And it takes a reference to a player, okay, or it doesn't actually need this. Actually, we can just change this to direction. Okay, self.direction is equal to direction. Okay, that was a bit unnecessary to pass in the entire player, and I'll need to actually go and make this change reflect in the player as well. Okay, where's the player? Where's this fireball function? There we are. So I'll just change this from self to self.direction. Okay, there are going to be a lot of small changes like this everywhere, so feel free to pause the video and think about why each change is being made. Okay, so I'll pass in that direction here. Okay, but I just realized something else, because the fireball takes a direction, a string, right or left. Okay, and on the other hand, the ranged enemy generates the direction in zeros and ones, and this is a problem. And you know what? We'll fix this actually over here. Okay, I'll say over here that it's equal to right, so I'll basically override it. Okay, and there, we're done. Okay, so now instead of zeros and ones, the direction is being represented in right and left, which the fireball can accept. Okay, and let's go back over here, and fireball is being created. Now what we need to do actually is create a group, okay, a sprite group into which we put this fireball. Okay, we can then iterate over that group, call the functions for the fireball. Okay, do you remember how we did it for the player fireballs? Let me just remind you real quick. Okay, we made this player projectiles group over here. Okay, and then we just put in all the we just kept adding them in. Okay, and over here we iterated over all of them and called the render and update functions. So just like the player which has a player projectiles group, I'll make one for the enemies as well. So all the enemies, every projectile that the enemies generate will go in here. Okay, and what I'm going to do is that I'll go over here into our ranged enemy. Okay, and as parameter we'll take in this projectiles group. Okay, projectiles group. Okay, or let's just call it group over here, and over here I'll just call it self.group is equal to group, or not group actually, let's just go ahead with projectiles group because that makes more sense. Okay, so now each enemy that gets created has a reference to the projectiles group. So whenever I create a fireball, I can just do self.projectiles group and add that fireball in there. Okay, and now if I just go back to game and copy this and change this to enemy projectiles, I can do the exact same thing. Okay, all the enemy projectiles will be rendered, but there is one slight thing. You remember how the fireball takes in a group, okay, and it checks for collisions against that group? Well, the thing is that we don't want to check it against the enemy group because the enemies themselves are generating these, right? Okay, so it's the enemy projectiles that we need to be checking with, the collisions that we need to check for are collisions with the player, not the enemy. Okay, the player projectiles are supposed to check for collisions with the enemy, and the enemy projectiles are supposed to check for collisions with the player. So what I need here is a player group, okay? And what I'll do is go over here, okay, and create a new group called player group, okay? Player group. Now, what the purpose of this group is to basically put the player inside, okay? I'm going to put the player inside like this, player group.add, put the player in, okay? Now the player is the only person in this group. Now it seems a little stupid to actually put just the player in here, but you know what? It's actually a flexible technique, because what if later on you have multiple players? Like what if you have what if you gain some kind of pet or something, for instance, okay? This doesn't need to be called a player group. It can just be called ally group maybe. So everything on your side, okay? All the enemies are your opponents, and maybe you have some allies, maybe you gain some friends during the game who join your party or something, so you can put them all into this group, okay? Basically, it's pretty handy. Okay, so what we need to do now is basically get this attack function working properly, because currently it's being called 60 times a second, okay, because of the update function, which is called every frame. So what I need to do basically is add a cooldown. So I'll go here and say self.attack cooldown is equal to 300 for 300 seconds, basically. Sorry, 300 frames. And since it's 60 frames per second, it'll be a cooldown of 5 seconds. So I'll come down here and say self.attack cooldown is equal to 0 or less than or equal to 0, just in case. Then shoot out a fireball. Otherwise, if you're still at like some non-zero value, like 100, decrement by 1, okay? There we go. Now, if we shoot out the fireball, we should reset the cooldown, okay, to 300. And the reason I didn't use events over here, because I think that caused problems if each enemy was generating the same event over and over again. So yeah. It's okay with the player, because the player is only one. There's only one player. So it's okay for him to have a cooldown event, but not really for the enemies, okay? So yeah, that's good. Now let's go over to our game file and just make a few changes here. I need to import the ranged enemy that we just made. Okay. And come down here, okay? Here we have ranged enemy and everything. We need to pass in a parameter. What parameter does it take? It takes the enemy projectiles, okay? And yes, currently I know that with the current system, with the current event system, we're only generating this event, okay? And because of that, we can only generate either the first enemy, the block enemy, or the ranged enemy. So we'll actually have to work on this and maybe have a set number of enemies that are ranged, set number of enemies that are the block enemies, or maybe just randomize it, okay? Like every time the enemy generation event is called, randomly generate one of them. I don't know, okay? There are many possibilities and we'll take a look at that later. So that was a mistake. I actually did that a bit earlier. Ignore that. Correct that if you haven't. So one more thing that we need to do actually is go over to Fireball, and this is actually going to throw an error because we're no longer passing in the player, or more specifically, we're no longer passing in the person who's generating the fireball. So I'll create a new parameter called position, and we'll just pass this in as the parameter, okay? And I'll go over to the player class, okay? And we'll just make this change right here. Where is it? There. So I'll just go here and just pass in the position. Okay, that's all. And let me go over to our ranged enemy and do the same thing over here. Self.rect.center. Good. And let's just double check everything. Okay, passing in the projectile group, assigning the group over here, changing the direction based off, changing the image based off the direction. Okay, it's initializing everything. And okay, by the way, make sure to make this change because I did this off screen, because previously that these were 0 and 1. I changed these to right and left. Okay, so just be sure to change those as well. Okay, and oh, look at this. That is going to cause problems, definitely. So which one is which again? One is left and right is 0. Okay, good. And is everything else okay? Okay, it looks good. Let's run it and hopefully we should see some good output. By the way, I've lowered the audio, okay, just so that it doesn't interfere with the recording, so don't be worried. Okay, so they're shooting out, okay, they're shooting fireballs, and the fireballs don't actually hurt us because we haven't implemented that yet, but things are pretty decent. Okay, ignore the lagging, by the way, and the enemies don't hurt us upon contact either, so that's good. Okay, so yeah, alright, so there's still a lot more to implement, but luckily we've done the main part. Okay, let's go over to the player class. Okay, and what we need to do basically is check for collisions against the enemy projectiles. How are we gonna do this? Indeed, let's think about this. Let's just go over to update. Where's update? And make a function for check projectiles. Okay, check projectiles, and I'll make this function over here. Check projectiles. Okay, and the job of this function is to take a group, okay, and we'll pass this in over here, enemy projectiles, okay, and enemy projectiles. This uses the pygame.sprite.sprite_collide any function against itself and the group that we passed in, and if there's a collision, what we do is self.player.hit, okay, and he'll take 1 damage. Okay, that's all this function does. It's pretty simple. Now, where do we pass in this enemy projectiles function? Let's go back to game, and over here in the player.update function, I'm gonna pass in enemy projectiles. Alright, cool. So I'll go back over here into game, run it, and what is your problem? It's not defined. And why not? Probably because of capitalization, I guess. Yep. So there we go. And let's try this again. And now the player should hopefully take damage properly. Come on, shoot. Oh boy, this is a problem indeed. Okay, he's taking damage. Okay, he's taking damage, alright. And yeah. But the enemies are not turning. Okay, and more importantly, one major issue is that the enemies are just moving and they're just shooting randomly. Okay, they're shooting in front of them. Like, what if the player is behind them? Why are they still shooting in the opposite direction? So we actually need to implement this, and that's basically what the turn function is for. Okay, so this is basically the last major thing that we're going to be putting inside this video. Okay, so bear with us a bit longer. Okay, so what I currently need to be doing is, alright, first of all, why isn't the enemy turning? And of course, that's because when he reaches the end of the window, the only thing we change is the direction. We're not actually changing the image. So this should fix that. Okay, that's one problem solved. Now let's go ahead and fix the turning. So before I go to the turn function, I'm going to create a cooldown for it, because I'll actually explain what this does in a minute. because if we don't keep the turn cooldown, I'll explain what problems will be caused. But I'm going to copy the same template over from here, okay? But will you be using turn cooldown instead, okay? And just remove that and reset the turn cooldown to 120. Now what I want it to do is if, okay, this is going to be a bit tricky actually. Alright, so I'm going to open up Paint to briefly explain one or two things. Now there are two conditions under which we want the enemy to turn towards the player. Condition one is if this is the player, you know, he's the circle, and this is the enemy. And the enemy is facing in this direction, so we want the enemy to turn towards the player. And it doesn't matter which direction the player is facing in, by the way, okay? We just need the enemy to turn towards the player. And for this, I'm going to put in the condition of if player.pause, and yes, I know we don't have a reference to the player right now. I'll get that in a minute. But if player.rect.centerx is, and if we minus this from the rect.x position of the enemy, okay, and if this is this going to be less than 0 or greater than 0? If we minus the player, okay, the player is over here, so the x position here will be less than the x position over here. So if these two subtract, if this subtracts from this, then we should end up with a negative value. So if this happens, okay, and the enemy is facing in the what direction? He's looking in the right direction. So if these circumstances occur, then turn the player. Basically, this is condition one. The second condition, and yes, I know this is actually kind of complicated, but you know we just need to do it. Okay, so the second condition, let's just plan that out right now. Let me just delete all this. The second condition is basically when the player is over here and the enemy is over here and the enemy is looking in this direction. So what we need to do is just go back here and just copy this actually, and over here and say greater than 0, because guess what? The position of the player, the x position of the player is greater than the position of the x position of the enemy. So it's obviously when they subtract, the result will obviously be greater. Okay, so yeah. Now I know this was kind of complicated, and I hope you understood that. It's a bit hard to explain this kind of thing. So yeah, without further ado, let's just make him turn. How is he gonna turn? Well, we're gonna just change his direction. If he's pointing right, make him point left. And over here, we'll do the same thing. If he's pointing left, make him point right. Okay? And what else do we need to do is we need to change the image. Okay? Like this. So come down here and there and there, and change this to the left image. Okay. Hopefully that should be it. Come on, let's run this and see our output. Okay, now, okay, there's an error here. Oh, I did not do the player reference. Okay, that's a bit of an issue. Where do we need the player reference? Okay, let me pass in player over here. And what calls self.turn? Update. And update actually has the player reference. So we can pass this in, no problem. Okay, so let's run this and we should see something interesting, hopefully. Okay, look at that. They're correcting the position. That's kind of cool. Now, one thing you may want to do is increase the turn cooldown. Okay, because currently what's happening is that it's checking for, it's basically, yeah, every 120 frames or 2 seconds, it's basically checking to see, do I need to change my direction do I need to update my direction? Is the player behind me? Am I pointing in the wrong direction? So basically, yeah. Okay, so if I go over to game again and try this again with an increased turn cooldown, let's see what happens. Okay. Now, more importantly, why aren't they attacking? Okay, that's weird. Let's go back over here and check. Alright, so I figured out the problem. It's because we have attack cooldown over there, not turn cooldown, so I just fixed it, okay? And I'll go back here and reset that back to 120, because I believe that's a good value, okay? So let's see what happens. Okay, now let me try running over to the other side. Okay, see, he's not turning too fast and not turning too slow either, which is exactly what we want. Okay, because if we set the value of turn cooldown too low, then what happens is that they're like turning instantly. You jump over them and they'll have turned before you've even landed on the ground, which is kind of stupid. So yeah, that's why we keep the values a bit high. Alright, now other than this, we have just one thing left that I want to resolve, otherwise our game won't be considered complete. It's that we need to fix the way enemies are generated. Okay, because we really need to do something about that, because we can't have just one enemy type generating, right? So we need to come up with a realistic way that we can generate multiple enemies. So what I'll do now is go up here, import random. Okay, I'm just gonna make a simple system. Okay, I'll also explain how we can make this better. Just let me finish this first. Choice is equal to random.randint01. Okay, and if choice is equal to 0, then do this. Else, if choice is equal to 1, then do this. Okay, and 1 second, enemy is equal to none. Okay, and put this over here, create an enemy. There's no parameters, so there we go, and there we go, we're done. Now the reason I did this, by the way, just in case you don't remember, is because if I do it like this, then these will be part of the local scope in this if block. Okay, and yeah, basically check out my video on variable scopes and stuff if you want to learn more about that. Otherwise it's pretty simple. So let's just run this code now and see what happens. Okay, good. Alright, so now we have a pretty diverse set of enemies, and we have like ranged enemies now, and we have like close contact enemies as well, so that's ended up pretty good. Okay, we now have a diverse cast of enemies, and we could go ahead and add some more in. I obviously won't, because I think we've covered quite a bit already, but basically, yeah, the concept is there. And the way you could actually improve the enemy generation system is create separate events for each enemy. Okay, and if you remember correctly, let me just go ahead and show you this, just in case you're interested in extending this further. Where is it? Level manager and level. Okay, now in the level we have an enemy count variable, right? So what I would recommend you do, if you want to extend this further, what you could do is turn this from a variable into a list. Okay, so something like self.enemy count is equal to this. Okay, and this tracks the number of enemies. So you could have like 5, and you could have like the 2. So 5 melee enemies and 2 ranged enemies. You could basically change the system up like this, okay, and change the code accordingly. Okay, I'm just giving you ideas, okay, just in case you want to continue this. Okay, so with that, we've finished up with the first video, the first bonus video. Okay, so we may release some in the future. Okay, I think I have plans for at least one, in which we'll just wrap up the game. Okay, make a game over window and make a few transitions. Okay, interact with the buildings a bit, because currently we're jumping directly to the dungeon. Okay, the battling stage, without actually going through that castle that we actually made. So we might take a look at this. Okay, other than that, I think we've done pretty well in this video. We made an entire new enemy. We've made a ton of changes. I think this is probably the biggest video we've had so far. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys liked the content. I hope you guys subscribe to the channel and keep an eye out for other Pygame content, other Python content that we release. Okay, see you guys in a later video.